South Africa's agriculture sector has had several challenges this year, from rolling power cuts to input costs. Now, let's take a look at what we can expect in the new year. I'm joined by Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Wandile, thank you so much for joining me. And I guess before we even go ahead to the year that's coming in a couple of days, how would you categorize the industry for 2023?
Thanks for having me on, Masa. I think, Masa, for 2023, it was roughly, I would say, a mixed year for South Africa's agriculture, because anyone that is farming, for example, say, grains and oil seeds or fruit, I would say they had a reasonably better year. To an extent that if you think about the grain production in general, for many of the crops there, we're having second largest yields on record. But of course, then if you were to turn an eye for a moment and look within the livestock and the poultry industry, there were some challenges. We experienced animal diseases, such as the foot and mouth disease in cattle. And if you had to think about poultry, we had what we call the avian influenza, and in a pig industry, we had the African swine fever. So that part of the agricultural sector was strained, while all of the other subsectors of the sector did fairly well. So I would say a mixed picture, but overall, I would still say it's back up to those years that have been positive.
And when we are looking at those diseases that affected the livestock, from the avian influenza to the African swine flu, what measures will be put in place to ensure that we can tackle this come 2024 if it happens again?
The challenge with these diseases, Martha, is that it's not unique to South Africa necessarily. We've seen them happening elsewhere in the world. But what was a challenge for South Africa this year is that they all occurred almost at the same time. And now that combination of those diseases at the same time, they had that massive impact. The other weakness was within our biosecurity facilities. Either it's monitoring of the diseases, manufacturing of certain vaccines, and even registration of some of the medicine. There were some slow processes there on the side of the Department of Agriculture. But the positive that has come out of this is that both the industry and the government seems to be talking right now, and they're really looking at saying, in the future, how can we ensure that we are better prepared for some of these outbreaks? And I think that work is important, because what we all need to appreciate is that when we're looking at the South African agricultural economy, nearly half of it is livestock and poultry. So when you are facing diseases there, it really has a major drag on the industry at large. So I hope that in the next year, we could intensify that work, and then there could also be effort on improving our vaccine manufacturing. And certainly we are already seeing some of that work happening between the government and the private sector.
And earlier this year, we saw raised concerns about the poultry sector, specifically when it comes to the supply of chicken. Where did we end up with that? Because it doesn't seem that it did drop or it was affected much.
I think everyone was in a right place to be concerned about the supply of chicken, and certainly the industry and the government did put some measures in place, such as, for example, ensuring that there's importation of certain fertilized eggs so that they can assist in the rebuilding up of the herd, and also importing some of the powder and liquid eggs that can be used for baking, so that some of the whole eggs can go back to be sold to people. So there were a range of those measures that were put in place, and I would say the agility of the poultry industry in one part was one of the things that had assisted on that. And again, the regulators coming into play and working with the private sector together during that time of strain, I would say it assisted. But I think going forward, we have to find measures to be better prepared on that. And that's the conversation that has been happening towards the end of the year. My hope then is that in the next year, we could see the continuation of those efforts and not take the foot off the brake as things seems to be easing. So that's certainly something that we're worried about. But I think, Masa, there's also some of the positive aspect of this, because if you're looking at the sector, take, for example, on the export performance in 2023. We have data for the first 9 months. And if you were to look at it, we exported roughly about $10.2 billion worth of agricultural product, up a percentage point from the same period last year, which further shows then that there were some things that were going well, and there were some that were really at the fault by nature, and also the regulators were at fault in some of those things, which is mainly this issue around the animal diseases and the other aspects that you mentioned in your opening remarks.
You speak of the faults of the regulator and, of course, the ongoing conversation between the industry and government, and that it's actually getting better now. But what's taken so long to get to this point? This isn't the first time that we've experienced such diseases as the African influenza and the avian flu.
You know, the South African agricultural sector has this thing which we call Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan, which was launched in May 2022. The hope then was to say this plan is detailed enough, commodity by commodity, also commodity corridors per regions on saying what can do well where in as far as agriculture and the value addition. And the hope of it was that it would spark a bit of growth in rural economy, create jobs, and bring all of this vibrancy in the sector to an extent that some people, and ourselves included, we were estimating that if implemented successfully, it could lead to growth of between 15 to 30% in gross value added of the sector. Now, all of the problems that we are talking about today, they were highlighted in that master plan and what needs to be done to address that. I'm alluding all of this to say, had we gone on effectively to implement the master plan, perhaps we would have limited some of these faults that now we are seeing. The challenge with the master plan, of course, it was the responsibility of both private sector as well as the government and labor, because it was all co-created. But I think the government should have led the way on doing that. And I hope that in the coming year, they will perhaps maybe be able to do that, because even now there's some pessimism that is boiling up in the sector as those delays have happened. But I think it's really a fault of everyone that was there, but the government could have done much better on ensuring that we implement that, and then we would have limited the impact of some of these things.
Considering that pessimism sentiment from the industry, what are the chances that government will implement this master plan that you speak of? And if so, how soon?
I think in conversations that I've had with the leadership at the department, and certainly within our side at the Agricultural Business Chamber, we are seeing, of course, that amongst our members are major concerns about the slow progress, as well as some of the challenges that the sector has faced, either at the ports, municipalities, service delivery that has worsened, and roads and the rail infrastructure issues. Those are some of the things that the colleagues are complaining about. But of course, then we think that if the government at the start of the year can be able to really call the industry together, outline the timeline as well as some of the stages of the things that they'll be doing on their side, that perhaps may be able to get everyone on the table. But the pessimism is there in the sector right now. For example, at the end of this year, if you were to look at the fourth quarter reading of what we call the Agribusiness Confidence Index, it had deteriorated to the lowest level last year during the second quarter of 2020 when we were in COVID. What that index was measuring, of course, is that within amongst the agribusinesses and the commercial farmers in South Africa, they are not really as optimistic about the business conditions in the country, very downbeat, and some of the things are the ones that we have talked about, which they were citing as their major concerns. So implementation and dealing with structural things of ports, roads, railway line, municipalities, and of course, to an extent, increased geopolitical uncertainty. Those are some of the things that I think would help a great deal.
And speaking of them not being optimistic about the business conditions, I guess one of the bigger factors would also be the ongoing power cuts.
I mean, the power cuts is a major one, and we were very worried, of course. You may recall this from the start of 2023, because as the year started, load shedding had intensified at that time. And the major issue for South Africa is that all of our fruits and vegetables are under irrigation. And when you think about the field crops, which is your maize, sugarcane, soybeans, sunflower, roughly a third of that is also under irrigation. So what we're worried about was that intensified load shedding would lead to major losses there. But we were lucky in the sense that it was also a rainy season, which really then meant that irrigation demand is not going to be as high as the typical year when we're not in a major rainy season. And secondly, agribusinesses and the farmers did incur a lot of debt to put alternative energy sources, as we're already seeing before the implementation of the losses that were recorded in poultry sector and the others. So energy remains a major issue, but there's a lot of investment that has gone through to put alternative energy sources by a number of agribusinesses.
And unfortunately for those who may have not had the finances to put those measures in place, they may then be affected by what we saw at the beginning of this year, as you speak of those intensified power cuts. How do we know that moving forward, as we get into the new year in a couple of days, that we won't now see that again? And then let's say we don't have Mother Nature saving us again like it did this year with the rainy season. What does it mean for those farmers?
I mean, we remain on a broad level optimistic about the 2024 season, because already now, when one was driving around South Africa and what's happening to the farms, it's lush and green across most regions of South Africa, perhaps with the exception of few regions in around Northwest and the Western Free State, where there's still some need for major rainfall. So I would say broadly on that perspective, we are looking well, but that doesn't mean that the load shedding, because intensified load shedding, I think when you're passing stage 2 or so, it begins to be very tough for many of the farmers. And if you are unable, of course, to put alternative energy sources to carry you through or that means that even in the year that we are leaving behind, those people have experienced major losses. But even those that have put alternative energy sources, that has come at a major financial spending. And you see that in the farm debt in South Africa, because farm debt now is at a record level, just around about 200 billion rand. That shows you, if you were to look on a year-on-year increase of the farm debt, and you see how much was accumulated just over the recent past, which is related to some of these implementations that have been put in place related to energy. It shows you that then. So really, the financial conditions are reasonably tight in the sector, I would say, but I'm still optimistic that 2024 will deliver a better season for South Africa's agriculture.
Thank you so much for your time and your insights. That was Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa.